which of these forms, whether it be revolution or whether it's a nonviolent commitment, which would you feel is more in keeping with the direction that an Islamic form of liberation theology might take? But they're very different things.
Thank you. Felix.
Good evening, I'm Felix Körner from Gregorian. Thank you very much for the great talk you gave. I think we all learned a lot. I at least appreciated and profited a lot. When you came to your train story in Pakistan, I thought you were already taking up what I wanted to ask while I was listening to you before. Maybe you can push that idea a bit further, because we enter the year 2017, rethinking the Reformation. Luther is very present. Much of Lutheran theological critique of liberation theology says the real captivity of humanity is not only social and political power structures, it's also us being captives of sin. Obviously what they mean when they say sin is the Pauline, Augustine selfishness caught up in our own incurvation into ourselves and so on. Now, our Protestant counterparts remind us of the necessity of being liberated also our own soul's captivity in selfishness. Christianity traditionally has developed its strategies to answer that, but not to resolve it, to solve it, obviously. Yeah. But I want to challenge you on, do you have any counterpart to the social side of your liberation theology? Last sentence. Pope Francis, I think, is very much aware of this, and we are a bit surprised of his way of trying to restructure the church, and he's not doing much of structural change, precisely because he thinks he can't change anything if hearts don't change.
During my studies in universities, and I had in Brazil some experience about social problems, and so I am very proud that these kind of things are also in the Islamic thought, that we go and view the society from the people that is excluded, I can say in this way. But my question is also connected with Thomas, that what is the key for preference key to do this liberation? Because in my our experience, I was very tempted to use violence in front of degraded social society. But for me, that I am Christian, so this is the connection, because I think that communism, for example, in Brazil, gave opened mind to people about this, but I was very in doubt about the key to arrive to this liberation. And for me was a kind of salvation that with another friends we went to the bishop in our city, and we asked him, where is the more excluded people in this city? There. So we started something
First, Father Tom Michel, I drew all of them into this nexus of what I call the Islamic liberation theology tradition that they were. And it is true that some of them also employed violent methods, and others were principled advocates of non-violence, such as, for example, Bacha Khan. I think that both of these methods, and now you know in Islamic thinking, I'm sure also in most religious thinking, the question of precedent is always important. Can you justify it in terms of earlier church councils, in terms of the Sunnah, in terms of the Quran, and so on? I think that both traditions can be justified in the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran explicitly gives permission for violence. And then there are, of course, terms, there are, of course, texts in the Quran that can also be, at a superficial level, be seen as not only just giving permission for violence, but also encouraging. Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu harrid al-mu'minina ala al-qital. O Prophet, spur the believers on to battle. Then there's another text, كتب عليكم القتال وهو كره لكم عسى أن تكرهوا شيئا وهو خير لكم وعسى أن تحبوا شيئا وهو شر لكم والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون. So it seemed as if the believers didn't like the idea of fighting, at least at some stage, the early believers. And then this verse was revealed. Fighting had been prescribed for you, even though you disliked it. And then there's an interesting one, for Muslim ethics especially. It is possible for you to dislike something, and it is good for you. And it is possible for you to like something, and it is bad for you. Wallahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun, and God knows and you don't know. And so the whole idea of, what is the foundation of our ethics? Is it just the text? Is it just God? Or is but that's a side conversation. In some ways, to return to my train analogy, I did use physical force to get my way through to the front of the train. Because from where I was, the train stops for just a few minutes at the station. If I had engaged in argument with people at that moment and discussing with them, I would never have gotten to the train doors. And my priority was to get to the train doors. So I pushed people out of the way. I literally, physically pushed people out of the way. I'm not going to make excuses for the fact that I pushed people out of the way. And at the same time, I have to guard against an arrogance. That just because my objective was a higher objective than these other people who were on the train and that they were selfish, therefore my mechanisms is always a good mechanism. So I want to say that there was an element of violence involved in my pushing towards the train and running to the other side and pushing people out of the way again. And I used a loudness of voice, I used a physical strength. I'm not quite sure if I still have it. We'll see. Anybody wants to take me on afterwards. But Tom, in our world today, it isn't possible, I think, to engage in violence without two things happening. Without you also becoming dehumanized in the process. The second thing, in the contemporary wars, it isn't possible to engage, it's not a simple hand-to-hand combat. And so it's not possible to engage in any violent strategy without collateral damage. And the killing of innocents in Islamic law, it is prohibited. And the damage to the environment is prohibited in the legal, I'm talking, if I'm to talk Sharia now, the destruction or the pollution of rivers, or the destruction of trees that you are prohibited from when engaging in war. It's not possible to engage in contemporary warfare without collateral damage and without damage to the environment. And thirdly, without also losing your own humanity in the process. And on the basis of this, I would argue that the option for me are non-violent forms of resistance, non-violent forms of attaining liberation. So like the Quakers, I adopt a principled attitude to non-violence, but like the Quakers, I am not going to say that any other oppressed community who opts for, in the absence of anything else, responses of violence to their own oppression, I'm not going to sit in judgment of those communities. I will focus my attention on non-violent alternatives, but I will not pass judgment on other communities. This was the Quakers' position in relation to apartheid South Africa, when the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela had taken up arms. That it is their task to focus on non-violent forms of resistance, but they are withholding judgment on other people. Lakum dinukum waliya din. I have my religion, and I respectfully, you choose you go for your option. The second question. I don't think that one should ever underestimate in the revolutionary project the question of sin and personal salvation. The question of personal sin and the question of personal salvation. Very often what happens in the revolutionary projects or in liberation struggle projects, you see, and we see this sadly in South Africa, where people who fought liberation struggles today with serious, committed, principled attitudes, the next day, those people become caricatures of the same enemies that they had opposed so principally and so courageous. And for me, one of the problems is that they did not take the question of personal transformation serious. It was social transformation, it was political transformation. It wasn't a question of ceaselessly reflecting on myself. How am I? How is my soul doing? How is myself doing? How am I doing for me as a believer? I don't expect it of all my comrades. Some of them were communists, some of them were atheists and so on. But how am I doing in terms of my higher ethical values or my conscience? How am I less prone to sin or more prone to sin? So it was this inability to reflect on your personal transformation, your personal inadequacies, your personal accountability to some entity beyond yourself that plants the seeds for anania, this selfishness, ana, and then in the end it becomes ana rabbukumul a'la. I am your supreme God. It leads to that. Me and my will and my desire, and And so you've just seen the Gambian president who was forced to resign, who was forced to leave now. He becomes the personification of the Quran, I will rule for thousands of years. What madness! But there is a link between this madness and the inability to think through questions of personal transformation and personal sin. But at the same time, I don't believe that there is a moment when the self is now ready to engage the other. The self and self-through transformation, this is, the self grows and dies, grows and dies. Our faith lessens and our faith strengthens. And then you feel tempted and you fall by the wayside again. And then you pick yourself up and you go again. There is never a time when you are now fully human, fully alive, fully encapturing your religious values and your spiritual values. Not even until the moment of death. So the whole idea that I must first work on my personal self before I can change social structures. It's not a theologically sound idea. The changing of the self happens in a reflection on your engagement. So our institutions are sinful. Ourselves are sinful. And the process to work through it and to redeem ourselves, it is a process that is deeply intertwined with each other. And so the structures of the church must change. The structures of our communities must change. We can't have utopian values of what it must be. We're living in the world, okay? So it's creative kind of management also, and you can't turn the ship around suddenly. But there must be a determination to turn the ship around. Now look, I mean, we have our own views of Pope Francis from the outside. And it is generally a very joyous view that we have from the outside. Those of you on the inside of the church may have your more nuanced perspectives of where the church is going, but certainly from where we have been in the last few years and so on. And it's not the false kind of rejoice that people had. You know, remember Obama got a Nobel Prize 2-3 months after he became the president, just because people were so relieved that they were rid of George Bush. So it's not that sense of, oh gosh, you know, we are so relieved that we got rid of Pope Benedict, and so now you kind of just embrace, you know, the new. I'm not saying that it is akin to that. I think that we have genuinely, from where I sit, we have a genuinely celebratory figure that many of us rejoice in the world. And I do run the risk of generalizing. I don't know which side of the church debates many of you are sitting on, but I'm just giving my things. So I think that if this is indeed the case, this obsession with the inadequacies of the self, I think it is wonderful that you're sitting with a pope that in terms of your tradition and in terms of the community, the Pope does have the last word. There are still notions of the infallibility of the Pope, and at the same time you're sitting with a Pope that is so clearly embraces his own vulnerability and his own inadequacies. I think it is just absolutely, it's a gift unto the world to have a religious leader, a world religious leader that embodies these qualities, but at the same time changes especially from a religious leader. We can't wait for the religious leader to be sinless before you start seriously tackling the institutions that also promotes other forms of, whether it is corruption or other forms of sins inside the church. So to come to your question, Alvaro, I've dealt extensively with the question of hermeneutical keys, ways, what are the, certainly for me as a Muslim, what are the hermeneutical keys that I need to have as I engage the text? Because I do think that the question of lenses are very important. It's not just what does the book say. No, what experiences your pre-understanding? What? I've never been pregnant. It's highly unlikely that I'll ever become pregnant. Well, you never know. Don't think, you never know. Science is moving very fast. But I cannot read the scriptures through the eyes of a pregnant woman. I cannot, okay? So the question of lenses are important. The question of your positionality is important. I've dealt at length, and I'm not, this is not a plug for my books, which are on sale outside at 25% discount. But in Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, I've dealt extensively with the question of lenses. And for me, there are two important lenses. I mean, I elucidate 6 lenses. But the first 2 lenses are very important for me in relation to your question. The one is taqwa, and awareness of the trembling awareness of the presence of God and accountability to God. There is so much of revolutionary and ideological arrogance in the world today. Party politics, both in party politics, establishment politics, governmental politics, revolutionary politics, social movements, and so on. And I do believe that the idea of a trembling awareness of the presence of a transcendent to whom you are accountable to, I do believe that this idea is an important idea to block the nafs, to block the ego. And it is this ego and selfishness and self-centeredness that comes from the nafs that turns decent human beings into replicas of what they hid the one day. They become replicas of that the next day. So this for me is the first fundamental key. And the second fundamental key is the idea of the unicity of God. The unicity of God and how this translates into a vision of the world, of a united humankind, of an integrated society. But even that I find now limited. I think that the challenges that many of us are facing, we talk about interfaith dialogue, we talk about the liberation of humankind, we talk about God, of human beings in relation to God. All of our ideas are becoming increasingly inadequate in the light of the larger challenges of environmental injustices, the question of climate change and so on. I do think that it's important that we begin to think beyond just these humans in front of us.
Thank you. So quite clearly one doesn't want to take Catholic or Protestant liberation theology and clothe it in Islamic terminology. That wouldn't be right. The Catholic liberation theologians in particular got into trouble from Rome, not specifically because of liberation theology, but because of an uncritical use of Marxist thought. But that blocked the view for many people of the real strength of liberation theology, which was that all of them borrowed heavily from Moltmann's theology of hope. What I want to know is, in the Islamic approach, is there a sense of building a kingdom, a divine kingdom? Is there the sense that we have in liberation theology of the hope that here on earth, a kingdom that is a godly kingdom, that is just, can be constructed even now? It's not some future paradise we're heading towards, but that already here God's kingdom is being built, and that is the Moltmann hope that was put forward by them.
You also come from Pakistan, and specifically from Karachi, so it's a renewed joy for me to hear. I have a couple of questions at my disposal for you. The first is that how would you really differentiate post-colonial studies, subaltern studies, with that of liberation studies? Perhaps for me it is a little bit difficult to sort of delineate cleavages, as, for example, subaltern studies discusses about issues in women, as we talked about, and minority issues, issues of displacement, and so on and so forth. So for me, there is a particular element of similarity between liberation studies and post-colonial studies and subaltern studies as well. The second is that you talked about the very essence of the empire, the way in which empires actually come into the structures of our understanding of politics, religions, and so on and so forth. In terms of understanding the global structure, security and otherwise, you see, and you also talked about the post 9/11 situation. I would like to just ask you that in the post-ISIS situation, how would you sort of destructuralize post 9/11 and the post-ISIS situation and its implication in general, and its implication for the Muslim world in particular?
Thank you.
Actually, what is the place for the relationship between victims and oppressors? I'm wondering if the final goal that you see in front of you when you think about Islamic liberation theology is mainly the liberation of victims, or is this or what space is there for reconciliation and forgiveness? So for this new relationship to start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A couple of really good questions. The first dealing with the question of God's kingdom. In none of the writings that I am familiar with on Islamic liberation theology is the idea that we are going to create God's kingdom on earth. There are, of course, we have our own millennial theological positions for both Sunnis and Shiites, and there are variations of how this would pan out. The coming of the Mahdi, or the return of Christ for Muslims. The return of Christ and the reigning of a just order that will come when the Messiah returns. For Shiites, another kind of figure, but there is in both the Sunni and Shiite traditions the coming of the Mahdi, the coming of the rightly guided one. But that theological vision in Sunni or Shiite Islam has never resonated with any of the liberation theologians. So there isn't this idea of an ultimate utopia that we are working for. I'll be honest with you, I think that utopia was in part, that those notions were in part rooted in the Marxist concepts of a working class utopia. It was rooted in that. And there is much less of an affinity in the works on Islamic liberation theology and where it had been enacted between that and Marxist ideology. That one that characterizes certainly, especially the earlier Christian liberation theology days. There is instead a consistent that we have to work towards greater justice. And this is connected to partly the theology. I mean, I've often spoke about that the only utopia that there is, the only ultimate that there is it is an elusive God. When we say Allahu Akbar, God, it's not God is the greatest. God is greater than. So you imagine God, you imagine your utopia, and your utopia is greater than. You imagine God to be this, you describe God as this, you describe God as this. Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah amma yushrifun. God is free from what they ascribe to them, even what Muslims ascribe to God. So these are ways of perceiving God, but God is greater than. So if God is greater than, then this utopia, where God's kingdom is going to reign, it is not a kingdom of this world. We will always understand and find out new forms. I mean, one of the interesting things is on Facebook now. First, people thought that their own animals were cute and their own pets were intelligent. And when I would describe the behavior of my fish to other friends, and I started reading books on the psychology of fish and so on, my friends thought I was cuckoo. They thought I was like, kind of, the behavior of fish and how fish interact with each other, and they thought I was weird. And so everybody in the beginning thought that only their dog was like really intelligent, or only their cat was like really. But now with social media you realize that, wait, there's something much more going on amongst animals. Everybody now realizes that, wait, there's a lot more to dogs and cats and cows and horses than what we had. Of course, earlier generations knew it, but we had lost it. So now we are beginning to develop a new sense of animals through social media. And other than just the threat of the future of the earth, new awareness of something approximating utopia is getting to us. So this idea of an absolute utopia that's going to look like this, that's going to look like that, nowhere do you find it inside Islamic literature, and that there's no links between this and the theological idea of the just order, the just system that will come with the coming of the Mahdi, or that will come with the return of Christ. There is a strong relationship, not so much between post-colonial studies, where post-coloniality, it's very much of an academic discourse. It is located, its geographical home is the global north, although often its attention is the global south. But there is certainly much more affinity between subaltern studies that looks at the margins, and more specifically the growing field of decoloniality. There's a lot of affinity between decolonial studies or decoloniality as a discourse of the global south with liberation theology. But again, liberation theology centers the marginalized in interaction and in conversation with the transcendent. And so it is in some ways a discourse of this world, but it is a discourse of this world that is transitioning towards another world, and that is accountable to another entity that is the transcendent. So there are ways of cooperation and coordination and activism and so on, but the founts from which we drink in order to sustain us for this journey, what we drink to keep us going on this journey, we drink from different wells. We drink from different wells. The journey may be the same, and we have a different kind of armor that we cover ourselves with. I'm talking about, say, taqwa, for example. I'm talking about beliefs. I'm talking about the Quran. I'm talking about theological reflections. We have a different armor that we cover ourselves with as we enter these battles for social justice. But the objectives in this worldly terms are really the same. As for your request for a comment on the post-ISIS implications for the Muslim world, I think that it's very important that and it's very difficult. You know, when you have a white sheet on a wall and you make a couple of black dots on there and you ask people, what do you see? They'll tell you, we'll see the black dots. Nobody will tell you that we see a white sheet. And so underneath ISIS, there is a larger Muslim world. There are ordinary Muslims struggling to find their food for the day, going through their job, struggling to make sense of the presence of God in their lives, and sometimes, where is God in the middle of our sufferings? And these people, their blood is as red as the blood of Christians and of Jews and of atheists. And so they are ordinary. And so the one challenge that ISIS presents for us is for us to continuously see the white sheet and not think that the whole of this white sheet has become a black dot. It's a black dot. There have been other phases in our history, yes, that we've had black dots. There have been phases in your history when you've had your black dots. And sometimes we forget them, sometimes we cleanse it, sometimes these black dots re-emerge. So this is the first challenge that we have of ISIS. The second challenge is that, and it's a dual challenge, the second one. The one is that Muslim theologians have a responsibility to work harder at presenting alternative readings of our traditions and our texts to the simplistic, obscurantist, essentialist readings that ISIS is offering. So we have this responsibility. But the responsibility of ISIS is not entirely a Muslim one. It is also the one of political entities that invade and occupy Muslim countries, that destabilize Muslim societies for their very narrow political objectives. So you destabilize, you create, you demonize one demon over another. So now Bashar al-Assad, he's now the demon of the month. And I don't know what is this king of Saudi Arabia? Who's the latest one? Salman. Salman is like the flavor of the month. I mean, it's amazing. Trump came out with his list of 7 countries, all Muslim countries, and Saudi Arabia wasn't included in it. Saudi Arabia, in many ways, you know, the heart of theological fundamentalism. Saudi Arabia isn't included in it. In many ways, and I'm not kind of on an anti-Saudi tirade, but the understanding of Islam in Saudi Arabia is pretty synonymous with the ISIS understanding of Islam, including the chopping off of hands and the chopping off of heads and the absolute segregation between men and women. Women aren't allowed to drive a car, forget about driving their own lives. But nobody problematizes Saudi Arabia. Nobody ever imagines King Salman as the enemy, the tyrant. The Saudi jails are full of Democrats and journalists and people who have become terrorists just because they are Shias. So the lifting of one figure over another, then it was Gaddafi, then it was Saddam Hussein was bringing, you know, as the evil, and in the next moment, what power interest lies behind this? What socio-economic interest? What military-industrial interests lie behind this? And so when you continuously destabilize Muslim societies like this, with your own political agendas, 2 things happen. The one is people in those societies, in their brokenness, rush to simplistic answers. And simplistic answers provided by ISIS, not these bloody, but us, it leads to that. But it also makes the life of Muslims who are committed to justice and to human rights extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. Because human rights, gender justice, civil rights, this is now the language of these enemies who are crushing and banging at our doors. Do you want to identify with those enemies? So shut up about human rights. So the human rights communities in Muslim societies are under siege because we are now being identified with the enemy. So it's two responsibilities that ISIS listings. The one is for Muslims to accelerate our neutralizing of their theological weapons, but also for people living in the global north to consider how their own governments is complicit in the rise of institutions like ISIS, work in partnerships with oppressive Muslim regimes, and to challenge how we are making the lives for Muslims who are committed to the reform tradition in Islam, how difficult we are making lives for them. The last question on victims and oppression and the question of reconciliation. Even here, I was hoping that I could give a talk today without resorting to an analogy that I seem to use in every lecture, whatever the topic is. So today but now you're forcing me to use the same analogy. So there is this black worker during the era of apartheid. He has a white boss. He is exploited, he is victimized, he is abused, his sense of dignity is removed from him. Okay. Underpaid, exploited. He goes home at night. Doesn't feel man enough. Part of the removal of his sense of masculinity is the humiliation that he experiences every day at the hands of his boss. He beats up his wife regularly as a way of dealing with his issues. This guy, when I approach him at night, when he's beating up his wife, he can't come and tell me, don't speak to me, I'm a black guy, I'm oppressed, I am... No. Victimhood and oppression are relational issues. It's not identity. You're not a permanent victim. I am black, but I'm a light-skinned black. In relation to darker-skinned blacks, I'm in a position of power in social discourse. I have more privileges. I evoke less suspicion. In relation to women, I have more power than women. In relation to whites, I have less power. So, being a victim, and being an oppressor, these aren't fixed sociological identities. They work from moment to moment. And so, we are never powerless. I speak about less powerless, rather than the powerful and the powerless. I speak about less powerless. In different structures, in relation to your bishop, you have less power. In relation to your congregation, you have more power. So all of us are in the relationships of power. And so you have the question, and okay, I don't want to end off on a controversial note, but you have the question, for example, of our solidarity with the victims of the Shoah, of the Nazi Holocaust. So you must be in solidarity with the victims of the Shoah. You must be in solidarity with victims of anti-Semitism. But that same victim of anti-Semitism can be in a position where he or she becomes an oppressor of other victims on the other hand, like that black guy at night. He can become, so that victim of the Shoah can't come to me and say, no, I'm a victim of the Shoah. Allow me to bulldoze the homes of the Palestinians. I'm sorry. At this moment, I have two responsibilities. The one is to consider your hurt as a victim. I must remember that. You are a victim. I intervene in this violence at night with this guy. I must consider that you are a victim. But my priority now is the ending of the violence that you are perpetrating against this woman. Tomorrow we can talk about your counseling. Tomorrow we can talk about your hurt and so on. But you first have to stop what you're doing now. So there is a moment at which there is a decisive intervention between oppressor and victim. At the moment when you want to stop this woman being beaten up, then I don't have time for counseling you. I don't have time for counseling you. I must stop this woman from being beaten up. In the long run though, if I don't speak to you about your issues and counseling and therapy, and in therapy treat you as a human being, not just as an abuser, a broken human being whose brokenness is reflected in this abuse. If I don't treat you and deal with your brokenness, and if we don't enter into conversation about it, you will continue manifesting your brokenness and make other people victims of it. So there must be a vision of reconciliation. There must be the possibility of this couple again living in a loving relationship. And while I am forcing you now to stop your beating of this woman, I must be very careful that I don't do it in a manner that further dehumanizes you as a person. So resistance movements must adopt ways that also facilitate the liberation of the oppressor. The priority at that moment for an outsider is to get my hand off your neck because you could die. But the reality is that that guy who's got his hand around the neck of the woman, that poor guy is also not free. He can't enjoy walking around, he can't enjoy life, he can't enjoy God's son, he can't enjoy his kids. He is also all, because his energy is all focused on, and so freeing this woman is also an act of freeing this man. That man at the moment may not interpret this very kindly, but I'm not too interested in how he views the process at the moment. And this is, I think, where reconciliation sometimes becomes very, very fuzzy. And reconciliation becomes the language of people who want the maintenance of an unjust system. When you speak about reconciliation at the wrong time, in the moment of abuse, it becomes, it's like, in our culture, in our culture, when there are these domestic issues, we describe it as domestic issues, not gender abuse, not gender violence, domestic issues. Then we always say, Hariya, chalo, wapas jai, go back, go back to your husband. The woman's place is at the side of the husband, and so on. And we'll make sulh, we'll make peace between the two of you, and so on, without ever addressing the question of injustice and this guy's spousal abuse. And we just keep on sending the woman back to her family. So I think we must be very careful that we don't fall into this things of reconciliation without addressing the fundamental questions underneath, the injustice, but also the brokenness of the abuser. Thank you very, very much, everyone.
Thank you very much to you, Farid. Before we thank you once again, I would like to remind all the present that our next conference will be on the 23rd of February here at 5 p.m. And our next speaker is present today, will be Father Thomas Michel, and the title will be A Christian Encounter with Said Nursi's Risale-i-Nur. Now, just before I let you go, you know that as part of my role now, I should have, and I was writing down a few things as Farid was talking, and my role now is to pick up 3 or 4 intelligent things that he said and kind of summarize his thinking for you, but I just renounce to do that. I think he said far too many interesting things, deep things, and I don't want to pick up one of them for you. I think each one of us will leave tonight enriched and with plenty of food for thought. Thank you, and come back.